You're listening to A Book with Legs, a podcast presented by Smead Capital Management. At Smead Capital Management, we advise investors who fear stock market failure. You can learn more at smeadcap.com or by calling your financial advisor.
Welcome to A Book with Legs podcast. I'm Cole Smead, CEO and Portfolio Manager here at Smead Capital Management. At our firm, we are readers, and we believe in the power of books to help shape informed investors. In this podcast, we speak to great authors about their writings. The late, great Charlie Munger prescribed using multiple mental models and analysis. We analyze their work through the lens of business, markets, and people. Let's see, today's date is July 1st, 2024. This is our quarterly book list where we talk about books, and more books. Hosting this with me is my colleague, Seamus Sullivan. Thanks for joining me, Seamus.
Yep.
And today we also have a special guest. This is the first time on a Book with Legs podcast, an honored guest, I might add. I would say this person is very bookish, to use the British term, and we will have some fun with him. My friend, the CEO of the Arizona Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Danny Seiden, is here to join us. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you, Cole. Thanks for having me. I love talking about books.
So do a little bit of background on Danny. Danny was the chief of staff for our former governor of Arizona, Doug Ducey. He also has had other roles with organizations like Intel, as well as who I got to know him through. He was a former lawyer at Greenberg Traurig here in town, and he worked with a friend of ours, Bob Kant. Give a little shout out to Bob, who is an awesome gentleman to work with. And so, Danny, I'm glad you're here. You're our first guest, so I think we'll have a little bit of fun with this. But I just, you and I are always talking about books, so I figured what better than to tee up the other, nerd in the hood that I usually run into at Little League or flag football.
Flag football, and you always see me listening to a podcast, usually about a book. So yeah, we've had that. You're like, what are you listening to right now? And we'll pull it out and I'm like, show you. But yeah.
Nice. So like we usually do, we usually start ourselves out, by talking about what we've recently read. So I'll kick it over to Seamus to kind of teach us, what he's been going through.
Yeah. So I put a couple on there. It's what I learned about investing from Darwin. I usually measure how I like books by how many notes are in the last page because I take a lot of them. So this one had quite a few. And all three of these had to do in some way with kind of how we view investing, things we've gone through in the markets, et cetera. And one of the things that this book talked about a bit is punctuated equilibrium. And really it just talks about how species have evolved not gradually, but there are periods where they make big leaps. And he relates that to portfolios. And I thought about it for ours. We have a basic portfolio for a long period of time. We don't change it too much. And then when we see something, we go after it, and it literally changes to a different type of portfolio. So oil and gas was a good example. We didn't have anything, right, till 2021. And
when I always tease with people, I joke with them, what did I know about the oil and gas industry 10 years ago? And the answer is absolutely nothing. So we adapt. Yep. That's the one thing that we can do as humans, which is fun.
Yeah, and we had the cash, and we made the changes. So the next one was this one. I thought it's about complex structures or systems, and it's how nature works. And it talks about self-organized criticality, and a lot of it is basically, they put it in layman's terms, which is nice for me. So they talk about classical thermodynamics, classical economics are done as if things were in equilibrium. And in complex systems, they are rarely in equilibrium. They are constantly fluctuating. And they used an example of a sand pile. If you drop sand, the way that pile builds up, you are constantly getting little avalanches, and that is basically what it's a self-organizing system. And I related that to kind of what we do, like the Fed's trying to control things that are not controllable. They try to fix things, and all it does is make the sand pile bigger and makes the avalanches more traumatic, dispersing the energy, et cetera. And I thought it was really interesting. And third one, chancellors, which is good. It's I think we knew a lot of
it's
some
funny.
of it.
Yeah, talking about capital cycle. It's a book that Chancellor wrote while he was at Marathon in London, and then there's also, I'll give a shout out to the folks at Hoskins there in London who have come out of Marathon. And it's funny. I actually heard a gentleman from Hoskins present on the capital cycle, and it's the kind of thing where I'll give a lot of I'll give a lot of credit to Dad, where that's how Dad had thought about the stock market often bids things up when they're adding supply to an industry. So like here we are in Arizona. Think of like electric vehicles. Someone had a chart on Twitter yesterday where it was like there's like 20 electric vehicle companies. And they were showing like peak to trough returns of the EV car companies. And it was like the first 5 were already bankrupt. Okay. And so now the capital cycle would have told you, hey, supply is going to grow, returns are going to be poor, versus if supply is curtailing greatly, returns tend to go.
And he's a supply side guy too. He
correct.
looks a lot at that stuff. So.
And so, so that, I think it's a wonderful framework for thinking about it. I'd never even heard of a lot of those firms until we ran into them. But it's a good framework, and it's a good book for people to study. Let's see, my ones that I just got done recently reading, and these showed up on the podcast, but I just wanted to make a couple comments. Who Owns This Sentence by David Belos. I would have assumed that our patent law and our copyright law and things of that nature, there was good reasoning behind those. And the answer is it's like you'd be fooled by randomness. Okay. In other words, so for example, in some countries, it was based on 7 years originally. And then 7 years became 14, and then 21, and then as much as 28. And then it became your life or your life plus 7 years. Now, if you go look at copyright, I mean, the fact that Marilyn Monroe's estate can be continued to be controlled by effectively someone who's a professional manager of her legacy, or like what Authentic Brands, the company, does by managing all these people's estates is crazy. That is more random. It was never intended to do that. And one of the things that he advocates is that information being free to the public society. Just like, we have all this knowledge and information, it's the wealth accrued to society in a way. That stuff sitting out in society is far more beneficial for the public good than it is to have a professional manager. It's a very interesting way of thinking about that. He actually thought patent law was pretty good relative to like copyright law. Because as we noted, like using pharmaceutical companies, they lose patent after the indication is a certain set age.
It's a great point. And we have a lot of pharmaceutical companies on our board, but this issue of IP really matters. There's really no other industry in the world that is forced to hand over IP after a certain amount of time, depending on it.
It's even compared to copyright, it's unprecedented.
It is.
So that was terribly interesting. The other, the book we pulled from Antiquity, again, it's like we're in like with the war in Israel going on. I'm just like terribly intrigued by anything Jewish. It's just I'm just kind of I'm terribly intrigued by it. I would argue, you look at the history of anybody fighting the Jewish people, and it's a long history of people that are far less powerful than they ever were before. And so the book was on Herod the Great. And what I didn't know about Herod, because you read, when Christ was born, obviously Herod had put out an edict to kill the firstborn Jewish children. What I didn't figure out, and if there's any listeners that like can tell me the why of this, and I even asked like my pastor, and he didn't have a quick answer either. But Herod actually died in 3 BCE. So how did Herod die in 3 BCE? And he had an edict to kill the firstborn children when Christ was born. I haven't figured that out, but Herod's Jewishness is something Martin really touched a lot on. He came from a line of really what was priests, but not the main Levite line of priests is what he came from. That was very interesting. We got to do Barbarians of the Gate. I'm sure everybody's read the book. I mean, it was just totally awesome. I was sitting somewhere and someone said to me, "Oh, hey, I just heard Barbarians of the Gate. You guys had done it with Brian Burrow, a gentleman that was actually here visiting with me for a cup of coffee." And what I walked away thinking is actually how good that transaction was. You think about like how critical you could be about PE buyers and what they did, but the leadership of RJR actually, caused a large return for the investors and was getting a higher return than the business was in the end. So I think a lot more sanguine about that whole process than I had, thought about it critically and, kind of like, oh, PE's ruining our world. I don't think about it like that as much as I did when I was younger. And then the other book that we just got done, this will be out on podcast soon, A Little History of Psychology. The thing that the thing that I really liked, there was really two things, and we were talking about this before. I liked we talked about the question of, just like we used to not treat schizophrenic and mental disorders in the way we should have, which is actually deal with the patient as a person, as a human. She throws out the idea that mental disorders are a more normal part of life. We shouldn't treat them like they're an outcast in society. They should just be treated as they're just different people. And they have different ways of processing information than we do. And they're it's kind of like you have weird relatives and you deal with them as a weird relative, okay? But that also asks us the question, what about our children? Like, we all have children. I have 2 children with dyslexia, for example. And how do we deal with like things like ADHD, ADD? Should we over-medicalize those? Should we over-medicate those? And that was one discussion that we got into that I thought was, just very intriguing, out of that subject matter. So really good history. One other thing I mentioned to her is Carl Jung was this weirdo. I don't know, call him weirdo. That's not fair. He was this interesting guy who came out of Freud school, right? And he was actually interested in kind of things you can't see. And he kind of went to the occult in a way that you can read about. But I would say there's kind of 3 parts to the human. There's the physical things, like I could get sick. That's physical. There's the emotional. It's like, how are you doing? How do you feel? But then there's a third. That's true. You just can't see it. I would say there's the spiritual. And I think that's one thing that Carl Jung touched on is there spiritual implications? We always talk about things like, when people lose their job, or when industries leave towns in the Midwest, that's where you saw things like opioids show up. Well, I would argue that's the spiritual manifesting into the physical and the emotional. And I thought Jung made me think about that a lot more coming out of that book. Danny, what have you recently read? You
just sparked like so many different memories of books I want to talk about now with the topics you hit. Anything from addressing from Herod the Great to Herod Antipas and everything else. But I'll start with what I've read recently, and I think I texted you about the first one, and that's Same as Ever, which is a Morgan Housel book.
Yeah,
and
we talked about. Yeah,
I think he's much more known for Psychology of Money, which was kind of his first work in the same order.
Yeah.
And why I really like this and why it made me think of you is instead of, there's a whole portion about how you invest and how we tend to invest. We invest by trying to get the next big thing, right? I can sit here and kick myself and think about 10 years ago listening to NVIDIA and how we all should get on board with NVIDIA. And I had a friend who bought like 100 shares way back then. I know he's done very well recently. But instead of always trying to catch on what's, the next big thing, you should manage your portfolio around risk, because that's the one thing we know will always happen. We know these things are going to happen. There's going to be downturns. How managed are you? How diversified are you? So it might sound boring, but he really couched it, I think, in an entertaining way. He told the story in an entertaining way. But the best nugget that I pulled out of there, and you talk a lot about this too with psychology, is, there's this belief in our world that the best time in America was in the 1950s. And he kind of dives into that. Why is that? Because they didn't have half the cures we have now.
Yeah.
People's longevity of life wasn't as high as it is now. All these luxuries weren't available now. And it's because in the 1950s, the income gap was perceived to be smaller than it's ever been in U.S. history. And so it's this comparison game. Now, I don't even know statistically how entirely true that is, but we know in today's day and age with social media,
it's known.
Yeah,
it's just known.
It's known. Yeah, I know what I make, and then I can look at my neighbors and be like, well, they're doing this. Should I be doing that as well? And it starts to breed, jealousy and discontent, and that's more at the heart of it. So I thought that was interesting, and it's a good book. I recommend everyone read it. Don't agree with everything.
Munger says, envy is the worst of all sins. Yeah. Because you just can't have any fun.
It's funny because he quotes Munger, 50 different times.
Yeah, I know he's a big Munger fan.
Yeah. In the book, and I was like, man, it's like Cole. It's like having a conversation with Cole. The next one, on that kind of led me down a rabbit hole on this conversation, but a pastor recommended a book called The Progress Paradox by Greg Easterbrook.
Okay.
I don't know if anyone's...
I haven't read this, but I'm familiar with the title.
It's in the same line. It's why are people unhappy? Why is if society and our inventions and innovations are at all times high, and living has never been as comfortable.
Yeah.
Even for the poorest, it's never been as comfortable. Why are people unhappy? And again, it's as you progress, you become more and more envious of what everyone else has. You see yourself separated. You see that they're, and again, you're only seeing a window in what they want you to see too. So we know that's a fallacy. But what I love about him, and I don't even think he is a Christian, Cole, but what I love about him is his kind of like thesis at the end is the way to be happy, and this has been proven out, is to be altruistic, is to do acts of charity for others, is to take care of people.
Sure.
And he's like, that's the key to really living and enjoying this progress we've hit. And I mean, that points to Christ. That points to the most altruistic example
well,
we
by
have.
the way, what Danny hasn't told you is our kids actually go to the same school, and they call these things the virtues. And so in elementary school, our kids are learning about virtuous disciplines and virtuous behaviors. And so, which is, I think is a blessing. By the way, that's 90% government paid through charter schools here in Arizona. And Danny knows a lot about that through his prior work. So
I do. Arizona, we can talk about, how the public education system works in Arizona, but Cole and my children, they go to, it is a public charter school.
Correct.
It's a classical academy. It's funded with tax dollars. They follow all the same rules. They actually are at a disadvantage because they can't bond, they can't build at the same rates. They don't have the ability to do that, but yet they do, I think, more with less. And very proud to send my kids to that school. And I have all three there now. We've tried private, we had some traditional public. Now we're in this charter, and it's been very good.
yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Any other books you recently read?
I mean, I could keep going for like a whole hour here, but one
we'll
I would
put that
add,
on bonus content.
Yeah, you have no idea. I talk about politics on media all week long. You want me to talk about books? It could go on for hours. No, I read. So I had this conversation with our Democrat Secretary of State, Adrian Fontes, and members of his staff. And he was asking me about a recent trip to Africa I had. I go with Orphan Outreach all the time. And I was telling him how much I love Africa. And he's like, do you think it's a great emerging market? I said, no, I don't. He's like, why is that? I said, because they have no private property rights.
Yeah.
You can't trust an investment. And Greg Ansel on his staff sends me a book called The Mystery of Capital by Hernando de Soto, which he's a South American economist. And he basically says the reason why capitalism has succeeded in the West but failed everywhere else is private property rights. Yeah. And Cole, this is really relevant. I don't know if he intended it to be this way, because we're looking at a time where you're seeing squatters' rights.
Yeah.
We have a great chamber member, QT, who can't get their nuisance complaints responded to by local authorities. And they pay property tax dollars for it. So why do you invest if you can't protect your investment?
That's John Locke.
Yeah.
Right. The idea of private, what we used to be called private property is what we consider capitalism today.
Absolutely.
We've kind of just traded those. So let's pivot to what we're currently reading. Seamus, what do you have on your current list?
I have so Richard Cantillon, which is I just started it, and an Irish guy, so he's pretty smart. Talks about he really was the founder of kind of economic theory and coming up with it's called the Cantillon effect, and essentially what he says is that when money is put into the system, money just isn't distributed evenly. It is the people at the tip of the spear, I guess, or the faucet get the money first, and so it actually creates I guess you could say it creates uneven distribution of things. So people get things quickly first, then it goes to the second, and it creates a wave of inflation. It's a localized inflation. So take, for example, the tech business, right? So we've had 15 years of easy money. A lot of that money went to private equity, which you know pretty well, and banks. And what's the easiest thing to sell to investors and to grow is tech, right? I mean, it's scalable. It's far out into the future. So a lot of money went into that, and you can take a look at Northern California and the people that making that money. It was highly localized. It was also localized in the market. We've got a concentrated market, and so part of the thinking and why I'm reading the book is now that wave is gone there, it is going to go downstream. It's going to be distributed to other parts of the economy, and it's why we think, why you like the oil names and why we think inflation is going to
Well, yeah,
continue.
and we've also talked a lot about, like, with the proliferation of AI, okay, the assumption is that, like, that's going to be very tightly held. And like we talked about a lot is if you look at any technology adoption curve, initially with very few units, there's very high margins. And then as units proliferate, it's because price declines and margins decline with them. So for example, I was thinking about this the other day. I got a compact computer in 1998. My parents got it me for Christmas. This is like brand new computer with a DVD player. I remember the first movie I played on it was Austin Powers. Okay. It was a $3,000 computer, all in. It's very nice.
That's
I mean,
a
it's
nice
crazy.
computer,
I was that blessed, right? And that same computer would be like $500 today. So it's like, just to think about going from $3,000 to $500 in 25 years, what happened? Well, as unit volumes rose, prices decline. And so I was actually, you met my friend Jack Lynch. You met Jack, haven't you?
I don't know.
Anyway, so Jack Lynch, who's at Ridgeline, they're a partner of ours.
yeah,
and he's become him and I are always trading ideas on book. I'll probably have to have him now that I have you here, Danny, on the podcast, because Jack's probably listening to this saying, what the heck? We've talked a lot about AI, and here's the weird part is like, I actually think AI will do a lot for the general economy. I actually think it's going to hurt white collar wages, because what it does well is it codes. And that's exactly what blue collar doesn't do well, and that's what the low end unskilled wages don't do well. But the coder that just came out of college that has a lot of time on their hands, that's good competition for them. And by the way, that's the biggest growth in our college education.
No, Cole, you're right. It's so funny. I think the market's already adapting to this, and I'll use again our children. So my 10-year-old son has done coding camp, and this summer I was like, "Hey, buddy, what do you want to do again?" He's like, "Dad, no more coding. AI is doing all of that."
Yeah, exactly. That's what I keep saying.
My 10-year-old son lectured me on like, how dare I even say the word coding? He's like, we got a platform, Dad. We just have to learn how to do platform. So instead, he went and it was like an advanced video game development using AI.
Yeah.
And he was ID Tech at ASU, great camp, and he loved every minute of it. So the kids are already adapting to it.
Yeah.
But you're right. No, coding is done so much better by AI already. So.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Cole Smead, CEO and Portfolio Manager here at Smead Capital Management and host of this podcast. If you enjoy this podcast, I'd like to invite you to check out smeadcap.com. At our firm, we are stock market investors. We advise investors who fear stock market failure with a discipline that has proven success over long periods of time. Learn more about our funds at smeadcap.com. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Investing involves risks, including loss of principal. Please refer to the prospectus for important information about the investment company, including objectives, risks, charges, and expenses. Read and consider it carefully before investing. Smead Funds distributed by UMB Distribution Services, LLC, not affiliated. So what's your other book, Seamus?
100 Baggers by Christopher Mayer. I'm kind of halfway into that. I really haven't done much, but I know you've read it.
I'm familiar with it, so just kind of state his general thesis and what he's looking at.
Well, I think a lot of what he talks about is there are very few really good companies. And other books we've read kind of state the same thing. We hold for a long period of time, and there aren't a whole lot of good ideas. So when you find the good ideas, you need to stick with them. And a lot of what we've read in general is, intelligence is not a commodity, but everybody in our business is pretty smart, right? I think for in general, they're just not patient. Like it's hard. Your dad says it all the time. Just sit on your hands, and that's hard to do. But that's the best way to compound your money. You pick a good company, you do a lot of work, and you stick with the ones that are going well, and you stick with them for a long time. And compounding's great.
Chris's inspiration for the book was another book called 101 in the Stock Market, written in the 70s. So if you're going to read 100 Baggers, I'd probably read 101 first, so you kind of know the origins of it. I enjoyed perusing the list of stocks that had 100 bag and asked the question, where are we at in time? It was like 73, I think the book got published. So there's a lot of nifty 50 stocks in there. And then also, what businesses didn't make sense to me that were there, and what can I learn from that? It's like looking for, where were the bullets in the planes that came back? You want to figure out where the bullets weren't. Because that's why they
and he's pretty good about saying, like, this is not a statistical. There's all kinds of issues with the numbers, et cetera. But in general, it leads you to, I think, what our philosophy.
And by the way, I didn't give Seamus, and I want to make sure the camera pans to him right now. I didn't give Seamus credit for his awesome Arizona Diamondbacks shirt that he got on Father's Day
for free.
So we're definitely repping our hood here. So let's see.
I don't want to say that shirt looks like it should be free, but I think it's a great shirt.
It's just great fabric.
Yeah, no, it does look good. It looks sharp.
So Danny, what are you currently reading?
So as you alluded to in the intro, what I do for a living is I run the state chamber. It requires a lot of lobbying. A big issue for us this year was the continuation of our public-private partnership economic development agency, which is known as the Arizona Commerce Authority, run by Sandra Watson, good friend Nicole. What I found myself debating a lot at the Capitol was what's known as industrial policy. And that's where, a nation sets economic development policy that might favor one industry over another, right?
Sure.
And it feels even evil to say that, like I'm cutting against the free market, and it goes against all my Milton Friedman that I've ever read. But what I've learned in reality, going back to the founding of our country, industrial policy has always been there, and it's always been necessary for us to compete. And so something that I am reading, just finished, that was helpful in these debates was actually on the Subject of Manufacturing by Alexander Hamilton. And to be able to quote Hamilton as supporting industrial policy for manufacturing, really helped, especially with some very conservative legislators who wanted to hear, well, why should we? Why should the government be picking winners and losers? And we're not. We're basically saying we have to set a policy that levels the playing field. One of the reasons why we've fallen behind on, if you went back to the 80s, Cole, I'm sure your dad especially would know this, memory chips used to be all America, right? Then they moved over to Japan, they moved over to Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
We're never going to get that back. But they were using industrial policy. I mean, the state and the nation favored those industries and allowed them to develop. So
because I was going to say, Korea copied what Japan had done prior, and that's that. They said, what did Japan do post World War II, and therefore, how should we, to your point, generate our industrial policy?
Yeah, and manufacturing is something that can't be done by AI. At least not yet that I've seen.
Yeah.
So I believe that this big push, and it's really started with President Donald Trump through Joe Biden with the Chips and Science Act.
Yeah.
With TCJ.
Which is big here. This is a big deal
it's
here.
a big deal. Arizona's been the top recipient of grants from that program so far, and we'll have a meeting with Secretary Raimondo's office next week about that to make sure we're successful. I think that Alexander Hamilton recognized that if America, in our isolated world, does not do things to push manufacturing to be here and to be local, we will become vassals, just like we were with the UK back in the day, pre-Revolutionary War, but economic vassals. And so he really cautions against that. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. And then the other one I would add, again, you can tell the two things I do right now are like work and be a dad. And it's my why. I love being a dad.
How much do you work?
Yeah, a ton. But it's like,
you sound like you're in the investment business.
Yeah, no. I love the balance. But I'm reading, and this came about really funny, Cole. I don't know if your kids play a game called Among Us.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they played in like a tag version. So I always want to know what's going on with my kids. I want to be as involved as possible. I was like, tell me about the game. And he was explaining it to me. I was like, oh, this is just like Mafia, which is what we played, at church camps when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And so it's like, never heard of Mafia. So we had this whole conversation about it. And it kind of sparked my interest. So I got a book called Game Theory Genius by J.W. Heiss.
Okay.
And it actually is really fascinating because he talks about all kinds of board games and reality TV and why game theory matters. But what I learned is the history of those games, the Mafia, goes back to a social experiment that came out of Russia. The original game was called Werewolf.
Okay.
And it was about, same idea. You have a werewolf who's going around killing people, and the villagers have to catch the werewolf before the werewolf kills them.
Yeah.
Typically, there might be two werewolves. But the idea is it's an uninformed majority versus an informed minority. And almost 90% of the time, the informed minority wins because it teaches a lot about our culture that you can put out misinformation with confidence and you can win over the crowd, or they become so obsessed with self-preservation that they side to. And I think there's a lot of lessons there. So fascinating read. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, by the way, that was Danny's plug to say read your books so you're in the informed minority, so therefore you don't die in the game.
Very, very true. Yeah, great strategy, but great strategy for life too, because you can find confirmation bias information wherever you want it, but totally. Be informed, and yeah, it's good.
By the way, it's funny. I actually, before I mention what I am reading right now, the one thing I forgot to come back to on Nikki Hayes' book, she gets to Kahneman and Tversky at the end of the book. Okay. And I ask her the question. This is in the podcast. You got to check it out because it's fun to ask this question. I said, we know a lot. You're just making me think of this. We know a lot about like recency bias and anchoring bias. And Kahneman and Tversky talk about system one, which is our heuristic, quick things we do that we're naturally biased by, which creates relationships, finds a spouse, things like that. But then system two is like, well, should I do that based on the circumstances? Am I being thoughtful enough? And what are my biases? And I asked her the question, well, we know all this and we've studied this and we know this from behavioral finance. And so I asked her the question, will it change anything? And she's like, no, it won't change anything. I was like, okay, good. This is such a good
lose our advantage.
Yeah. So let's see. So I got three, and I know Seamus isn't one of these. First off, we're in the middle. Again, I mentioned this. I'm in this super Jewish season of studying and learning. We're reading Bonhoeffer by Eric Metaxas. Wonderful book, wonderful story. Just the life someone lives when they're passionately called to do something and they're willing to ultimately die for it is always interesting in my mind. And we're right at the point in the book where it's obvious that things are bad. And to your point, the people that are in the informed minority know how bad it is, but everyone else in society doesn't recognize the paradigm shift taking place. So, for example, the church is being really pushed to the side at the time. The German church, and there's this debate of, does the rest of the global German church secede or not, or do they write a confession? And so, just very interesting as we continue to go through that. I think the other thing that you take away from the book is things are slow, then all of a sudden. Yeah. Right? It's like change is slow, and then all of a sudden, it kind of quickly peaks. The other two books I have is Ben and Me, his new book by Eric Weiner. The book is really kind of like stylizing your thinking in your life based on how Ben Franklin thought. And we talk about Munger a lot, and Munger was a big Ben Franklin person. Munger was like an architect beyond being this incredible investor. Franklin was an inventor. And so I looked and said, you know what, in honor of Charlie, I need to read a Ben Franklin book. This is a new one to come out. Again, kind of a stylized guide into how Ben Franklin lived. The other book came out of an experience I had. Actually, our common friend, this would be like the name-dropping podcast episode, Jack Selby.
Yep.
Which, if you guys on the podcast aren't familiar with Jack was part of the PayPal Mafia. He has the largest venture capital fund here in the state of Arizona. He lives here. Anyway, so he had invited me out to an event at the Museum of the Bible, and had never been, thought, this would be really great. I had my wife come with me. And Steve Green of Hobby Lobby fame spoke, and he handed out copies of his book, This Beautiful Book. And so I cracked that open. It's interesting to think about this, and I also think about like your kids and my kids' education at the charter school they go to. We're in a day and age where, like, in the stylized 1950 dream world, everyone in America had a Bible in their home. That is one of the things of the 1950s. Versus today, a child like hitting 18 is the least likely person in U.S. history to ever even have read a Bible. So Steve's book is really, the story of the Bible through 5 stories of people in the Bible. And so it's a way of kind of creating almost a smaller picture of the Bible for someone who's never read it. I thought it was interesting too, because going to the Museum of the Bible, let's say someone walked in there never ever reading a Bible, it's a vast history resource. So, for example, if you're bookish and you really like to nerd out over books, yes, Gutenberg was not the first person to ever create a printing press. He was just the first person to mass produce books in the Western world, and obviously the Gutenberg Bible is the most famous of that. Well, prior to the Gutenberg Bible, we went from what they called the papyrus or scrolls to the codex, which was like the first book format we ever had. And so they have a copy of one of the original codexes there. And as like a history nerd, you just have to totally go crazy.
No, I agree. I'm just getting excited even listening to you talk about this, about these types of conversations. The Bible is a tremendously rich history book, and it goes to show. So Thomas Jefferson, not a Christian, very very much into that.
Well, by the way, the Thomas Jefferson Bible is where you take out the parts that you don't like. Which, by the way, as Americans, we do a lot of that. So we're very Thomas Jeffersonian. Go
to Library of Congress. You can see what Thomas Jefferson did. So even if you don't want to read about miracles or the supernatural, he cuts all that stuff out of the Bible, and he still found it to be this amazing book.
Resource, so, And by the way, if you go look at Shakespeare or Dickens, if you don't understand the Bible, you can't understand a lot of art and literature, ultimately, I would argue. So great. If you ever get the chance to go there in D.C., it's totally cool, really funded by the Green family, so I want to give them a lot of credit for that.
And I want to cap one thing you said on the 1950s, because I said it too. Peggy Noonan, who's one of my favorite writers.
Who writes for the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, writes for the Wall Street Journal. She has this column that she does every so often, but more or less the gist is this. One thing that is good about the 50s, that era, was that culture was safe. The phenomenon of bad parents, bad dads who walk out on their families, that's not new. That's been around for a long time. But it used to be, if you were a kid who landed with a bad situation at home, culture would catch you. And it was like this safety net. You had a community. You had churches, grandparents, all of that. That's not
Neighbors,
there anymore. Culture's not safe anymore. The community's not safe anymore. The internet has made it very dangerous, right? So that's one good thing we can say about the 50s. Culture was a safer place.
Totally. You made me think of the movie Sandlot, right, as a picture of like 1950s. In fact, I was rewatching with my kids because I don't think they'd ever seen it. And the kids pulling into his house in California, and what is moving their stuff? It's an orange U-Haul truck which obviously is based here in Phoenix. So I was like, we own the stock in full disclosure. So I was just like gigging out in 1950s Sandlot.
Great company, great stock, yes.
I have the kids watch that all the time too. Just old movies like that.
Well, let's pivot now to like the books we've had recommended to us, or something, a book that someone's mentioned to you, you bought, you just haven't got to yet. Danny, do you want to kick us off?
Oh man, that's a lot of pressure. There's all the time. I mean, I listen to you guys. I get sucked in even on social media to someone's about to make a book recommendation. It's like a movie trailer for me.
Yeah.
Well, they'll be like, you got to get this book. This book will change your life. And sometimes they'll turn around and be like, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. I'm like, I read that in 7th grade. I got it. But something that I've been doing a lot of work with pharmaceuticals in healthcare, and so the Emperor of All Maladies is a book about the history of cancer.
Okay. And
it is a huge, very large book, and I've been putting it off. But everyone says, and it's by Siddhartha Mukherjee, and it is fascinating. I've read a couple summaries about it that it'll take you through where cancer was first identified, like really to its origins, to all the ways in which we've innovated great, amazing treatments for it. And again, it's a testament to a conversation we had offline earlier that people are the world's greatest resource, that they're gonna invent, they're gonna innovate, they're gonna beat these problems that we've encountered, like cancer, like any kind of resource issues. So that's one I would love to get through and get to, because I think it will make me a lot more educated on this terrible disease. So
yeah. Seamus, what do you have?
I have a really interesting. It's called cod. I think it's. Somebody told me it's a sick, like a kind of bubble type book. So okay. Cod was used for everything for a long period of time, and that's pretty much what it's about. I haven't gotten really into it that much, but
yeah. So the I got a couple on my list, and these are ones that have come up for some random reasons, and a couple like just you kind of like and when you're making a podcast, you find a publisher that kind of knocks off a lot of good history writing, and suddenly you're like, well, what other books do they do? And so some of these are from the same publisher. So Enemies of All by Richard Blakemore, okay? This is a pirate history. I don't know why, ever since I was a kid, the idea of pirates and treasure has just always been something fun. I loved pirate Legos when I was a kid, in full disclosure. I do enjoy going to the Caribbean occasionally for vacation and doing a little history on the side. And so I'm really looking forward to reading that book. I'd never heard. I also think of Mike Leach of Washington State and then Mississippi State. University Mississippi State fame. Anyway, Mike Leach was a big pirate fan. And so therefore I kind of want to go through that to honor him. Atlas of Finance is another book. It's written by multiple authors, but it's kind of a history of economics, by not only geography, but also different, as we get out to cryptocurrency and things like that. So kind of an anthology of finance history. Danny's going to like this one. I just was thrown this. I want to say Richard Grant is a New York Times writer, I believe, but it's called Race to the Bottom. It's a book about Arizona. And what I read on some of the kind of the initial reviews of it is it's kind of like, yeah, Arizona's a crazy place, but it's a pretty good picture of where we're all going. Okay. And so he does everything from what I read about the book. He goes to the border, he talks about water, and he's living in Tucson, I believe. So that's going to come out here in the fall. I'm very much looking forward to that book. I'd love to have him on. It'd be really fun to have him in studio. For that episode as well, if we could.
I'm going to have to read that as well. I'm very familiar with the phrase, and I always love it when East Coast writers decide to tackle Arizona with their amazing predictions.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but it came off as like, from what I could see about the book, it came off, it reads like this place is weird, but yet it makes sense. It was my initial takeaway from what I could see from the book. The other one is by Megan Gorman. It's called All the President's Money, where I think she's giving the history of presidents and their wealth they have accrued, after office, and how that's changed over time is what I'm assuming. I think she's a financial advisor by background, so I think that'll be kind of interesting to think about. Now, again, it's like one of those ethical things where, in 1950s America, did the president accrue a lot of wealth? And the answer is, well, no. And now, obviously, being president, you go write a book after and you go on a book tour and you can make quite a bit of money. We hope you're enjoying the podcast. We work hard putting together this show, but we work even harder for our investors at Smead Capital Management. At Smead, we believe in disciplined investing, which is why the Smead funds have a proven track record of long-term outperformance. If you're an investor who fears stock market failure like I do and want to invest in wonderful companies to build wealth, we invite you to visit smeadcap.com. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Investing involves risks, including loss of principal. Please refer to the prospectus for important information about the investment company, including objectives, risks, charges, and expenses. Read and consider it carefully before investing. Smead Funds distributed by UMB Distribution Services, LLC, not affiliated. So I have some books that came out in the last quarter from what I'll call the Smead Cap tribe that we got in recommendations. One was Nobody Will Shoot You If You Make Them Laugh by Simon Murray. Simon Murray worked for some powerful companies in the East, including Jardine Matheson as a commissioned salesperson there. I ended up working for Hutchinson Whampoa, I think, for Li Ka-shing's family, and created the cell phone brand Orange. And so it's kind of his life story. The other book recommended was The Art of Military Innovation, Lessons from the Israeli Defense Forces by Edward Lutwak. I didn't get a chance to get any information, but that was another book thrown out to us. And then the last was The Coaching Habit by Michael Stanier. Was another book we had recommended. You don't know this, Danny, but we have a super fan to the podcast. We have a couple, but there's one that we typically mention. His name's Superfan Steve. And so I checked with Superfan Steve on what he's been up to. He's got 3 for us. The World for Sale by Javier Blas, who writes for Bloomberg and is kind of a known entity out there. The second book he recommended is actually another Brian Burrow book, The Big Rich, which is a story, I think, of 4 Texas families and kind of their wealth over time in the oil business. And then the third is also an oil title, Private Empire, ExxonMobil, and American Power by Steve Cole. Was the third book he recommended. So Danny, since we have you here, you're captive to us. I'm biased, but I want to ask you this. So, and I know some of this you get all the time, but the first question I think you get all the time. The second question I don't think you do as much. So you're watching this podcast. We're sitting here in Arizona. You know that Seamus is a Diamondbacks fan. You know that we gig out over this place as people that came from, both Seamus and I coming from elsewhere on the West Coast. You obviously came from Florida originally. There's people that didn't come from here, which is pretty common. How do you answer the water question? And as you mentioned, the New York Times wrote the Rio Verde is going to be a nightmare, and what they didn't say is that there was very particular things around that. So how do you answer the water question first here? And then the second question I wanted to throw you. Here we are, what are the big advantages for a firm like us being in Arizona, whether we're talking the investment management business or just say finance in general? What do you think the distinct advantages that industries like that have here in Arizona versus maybe other places in the country that the Wall Street Journal's been writing about, like Florida and Dallas, let's just say? Yeah.
Well, I love to answer both these questions, and I do quite a bit. Let me start with water. This is probably one of the things we have to talk about the most, and it's due to when the new governor, Governor Katie Hobbs, came in. They released a report that suggested we had a 4% shortage in some outlying unincorporated areas of Maricopa County in our 100-year assurancy in order to build residential housing. So what that means is, Cole, Seamus, you guys want to build a house, you want to build a community, you have to prove you have a 100-year water supply. By the way, we're the only state in the country that does that.
Yeah.
No other state does that. Texas doesn't cross over 20 years. California, for all of their nonsense and terrible policies, no offense, Seamus, they don't do that. They're a terrible water planning state. So we're a good, well-planned for state.
But real quick, what Danny didn't mention earlier, and we have to mention full disclosure, is one of the most popular sports here in Arizona is California bashing, and we're very good at it. So I apologize.
Well, as you'll see in my part 2 answer, I've picked up Texas bashing as well. So I've lived in both California and Texas, as well as obviously Arizona and Florida too. So, a lot of the states we're going to talk about, I've lived in and can tell you, I think, what are the advantages and disadvantages. But the simple truth is we have water here. When you hear about any kind of water shortage, because the East Coast ivory tower people who've probably never left New York City or Manhattan love to believe that Arizona is some dry desert that shouldn't exist. We're an affront to all the very liberal ideology that we should allow nature to run and growth should stop. up. And that's true. That's the way they write. They have no idea what they're talking about. If they did, they would see that much like Israel, since you're all into all things Israel and history of Jewish culture right now, we are a very well planned for, yes, we're a desert, but we also have demographics. We have 3 major sources of water. We get, surface, we have aquifer, and we have the Colorado River.
Sure.
And so when one goes down, you got to look to what the rest are doing. But we have enough water. There is plenty of water to go around. And, one thing that should be addressed too. When you hear about that shortage, we're talking about 4%. It's insane to think over the next 100 years, we will not innovate, particularly with ag, which by the way is about 76% of our water use in Arizona is actually ag. So if you don't think they're not going to use Israeli drip technology, NDrip, good Arizona company now, to improve their efficiencies, you're wrong. There'll be a lot more savings. The ag industry will get better. We'll continue to do management. So water is not a real issue here. But one thing I'll say, Cole, anytime we see a story like that, we either respond to it or I clip it, because one day I cannot wait to show you from the history of 1950 to where we are now, the amount of stories that have been written out of the East Coast that we're going to be a dried up Rust Belt desert. We won't exist. We've been predicted not to exist, I think, 10 different times by the East Coast media. And I love it because we're thriving. Yeah. We're growing. They're not growing. So,
and what Danny's saying is we got receipts. I think is what we're saying. And I'll add one more thing. So Danny and I live and in fact, where Seamus lives too. So where we live in Phoenix, if you go back to, there's great, cool, satellite maps from the mid 20th century that you can go back and look. And I love them because I can go pinpoint where my house was, and there were no houses there. It was all citrus groves.
I was going to say, it was orange groves, yeah.
And so the weird part is going from that citrus to the houses we have today, we use far less water. And so that conversion, like you pointed out, as we go from 76% of the water, being that to say maybe 60 or 55%, what that does is allows for human flourishing in a far greater degree in living versus production of agriculture.
And that's entirely right. And, we're the youngest state in the Great 48, right? So we're going to continue to grow and mature as a major metropolitan area. I know where we're sitting right now, there's about to be a very tall tower built.
Yeah.
And the more vertical we grow, the more efficient water use gets as well. So there'll be less of this sprawl and a little bit more urban growth too. And you can debate good or bad around that, but it will result in more efficient use of water.
Okay, so obviously a lot more people are coming here. So how do you attack a lot of people are going to Florida. A lot of people are going to Dallas for finance or the investment management industry. What is particular about Arizona that would make a firm like us or more firms like us, whether it be hedge funds, venture capital firms, long onlys, mutual fund companies that would want to draw here relative to those other places or from where they're at now?
Yeah, and I would say one of the biggest draws for a Florida or a Texas is 0% state income tax.
Sure.
So when you see the growth that they've seen there for people who decide to move there, that's a big part of that. You'd have to ask Citadel and some of those other funds, how much money are you saving? And it's not anything to blink at. But the truth is, again, in Arizona, the chamber ran a very strong anti-tax raise campaign years ago to stop us from moving into the highest top 10 for state income tax in the country, and we instead ended up capped at 2.5% flat tax.
Amen, brother.
Yeah, right. So it's great. It's a great place to come. That's locked in. And by the way, we also passed an initiative through the chamber last year that will require 60% of the entire state to vote to raise taxes. So it's nearly impossible to raise taxes there. So you have regulatory certainty. So move here, things. Even if you get a Democrat governor or Republican governor and there's a shift, that's not changing. You're not going to see your taxes go up. You're set here. I know housing affordability has been a little bit more of a topic. I think we're about to see a building boom, much like they saw in Texas right now, where a lot of people are underwater because they overbuilt. We're going to see some of that here in Arizona, which is going to help bring our prices down. But most important, and this, you want to be at the ground floor of where growth is happening.
Yeah.
And we are the global hub for the semiconductor industry right now. As the rest of the world heats up and the conflict in Southeast Asia gets worse, the fact that TSMC has invested $40 billion, which is the largest foreign direct investment in United States history here in Arizona, tells you there's a lot of money coming, there's a lot of manufacturing coming, there's a lot of commitment to make sure it succeeds. And we're going to need private equity. We're going to need finance to help fund models and help come up with new products to innovate our way through the challenging finance environment we see right now with higher interest rates.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting, you mentioned Sandra, the Arizona Commerce Authority hosted a CEO's forum for the Final Four here. I've never seen such active marketing for commerce and business and investment in my life, but there was a panel that was done, and I think Steve Sanghi of the founder of Microchip was there on the panel, and his panel in general, what they highlighted is that as they were recruiting people here, no one's from here. So therefore, the binding was everyone wants to get to know everyone because they don't have that connection. They don't have those roots, and they want to build those roots. And so you end up getting this really communal experience. And I think
I could talk to my kids. I mean, I brought it up to you. I think when we first moved here, we go to I'm Catholic. We go to a private Catholic school, and typically we have 3 now, but we had 2 when we first moved here, and they're young. And you go to a new school, and they have their groups already kind of set up, right? And it's always hard to go into them. And we came here, and everybody was. There were no cliques. Like everybody was very open. They brought them in and were super friendly. So to your point, it really is. And people talk to here. They go, "What do you do?" Like right off the bat,
they want to know what you do for
Yeah.
business. But the God here, if there's an idol in Phoenix or Arizona, it is business.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
commerce. That's the
Yeah.
idol.
But I mean, this is such a good point. So you're right. I think it's now like 74% of Arizona is from somewhere else. So people have chosen to live here. And what that has really done is preserved a meritocracy where it doesn't matter who your parents are. It doesn't matter where you went to school. That's what we've experienced. And I got to tell you, that's not the case in Texas.
Yeah.
That's not the case in the South. That's not the case in a lot of places. But here, it really doesn't matter. They want to know what you're doing. What, if you're talented and you work hard, you can find your home. You can find a niche of people. You can find a community here. We're very opening. Cole, you know this. If you want a meeting with a governor, you want to meet with anyone, there's not like, well, you got to do this or you got to do that.
Or you got to be part of this club.
No, it doesn't work that way in Arizona, and that's great. And you're right. I mean, gosh, even on the parochial schools, I can tell you because my son is friends with a ton of kids now who go to St. Francis, and there's such an amazing community. It's not closed off. They all. I love it. I love that about Arizona. I love we're an opportunity for all, meritocracy state.
When I'll to add to that, it's like I was just saying this before, and they'll go unnamed, but a couple days ago, a common friend of Danny and mine said, "Hey, I want to have you to lunch," and he had me to lunch to introduce me to one of the local billionaires. That just doesn't happen in any other city where you can build relationships and get to know people on a very personable level like that. That was I'm trying to think. Our colleague Emily had the same experience. She was down the road eating dinner one evening, and one of the local billionaires rolled up with the guy that runs his family office, and she got to know him, and I think she pitched the podcast to them, and so it's like, this is such a cool town.
It is. It is. Yeah.
So, do we want to flip to the other question, Danny?
Yeah. No, this is something for you masters of finance. To quote Tom Wolfe, the masters of the universe that I get to spend a little bit of time with today. How you guys talk about low stock returns a lot. I follow you on Twitter.
Yeah.
Or X. Everyone should, because you're always giving out good, I think, stable advice. But one thing that I hear a lot from a lot of my members and some of the C-suite guys is, when you're talking about low stock returns with the SP 500, which has traditionally been the safest place to put your money, with interest rates going up, a lot of people are looking at just standard banking, money market accounts now.
Yeah.
Can you explain this more and how you see this?
Well, it's your question itself. So, how often in say your adult life have you been able to go out and fetch 5% risk free?
It was very recent that's
very
been,
recent. I mean, I think the last time you had short-term rates anywhere near these levels would have been like the late 1990s. Or I remember in 05, the Fed had tightened rates on the short end of the curve to get back to 5%. So it's like you're talking about in looking back from a 40-year stretch, you've had it, maybe for 3 to 4 years of 40 years, maybe 10% of the time. Okay, so we don't think a lot about the competition for money, but that competition's out there. So, for example, if you just sat there rolling T-bills the last year, you made 5%. Now, is that as good as, say, the equity markets have made? The answer is no. At some point, could it be, though? Mm-hmm. Okay. One of the things we've been talking more about is this is not the Fed's problem. And I think we talked about this on the last time we did the book list. Bill and I talked about inflation. The government's spending money like a drunken sailor on leave. 7% of GDP. It's never happened before with less than 7% unemployment, and we have almost sub 4. Okay,
Yeah.
So the government's spending way too much. I would ultimately argue. I'll go back to Harold James' book, and I'm trying to remember his book title, but he argued that COVID was a war. We went out and did war spending. We used defense acts to get our masks and our vaccines and all this kind of stuff. But it was a war, and all the policies that continue to come out are war-like in spending size and scale and things of that nature. And by the way, this is nonpartisan. Like it was started by Trump.
Yeah.
It's now being done by Biden. Trump will probably come back and do that because it's very popular to spend. So I point all that out because that's where the inflation problem's coming from. And the real danger could be a 10% to see the 10-year treasury wake up at 6%. Now, why do I say that's a real danger? Because obviously having a fixed rate security like that's riskless over 10 years, that's dangerous. But that would actually also affect the economy. Think of businesses rolling debts, mortgage pricing, auto loans, et cetera. So I think that's when it could spill over into the real economy. But what we think a lot of this has to do is really wealthy people getting hurt or large institutional investors getting hurt. We actually have a slide that I want to throw up because this is how we kind of think about the history of this. Yeah, so this is looking at the household equity ownership here on the left screen. And if you look at this data, it's a wonderful data set. So this is St. Louis Fed, what they call the FRED data, is how they refer to this. And it's looking back at equity ownership since 52 is the blue line in the chart. And what you'll see is there's really kind of two major highs prior to this era, which was 1969 and 1999. So whenever I look at this chart, I always do think of the Eagles who said in Hotel California, we haven't had that spirit here since 1969. But so I always like studying the prior two instances of this because we got higher in 21 than we were in 99, and we're roughly where we were at 99 today. And in 69, the S&P made like 5.87% compounded during the decade of the 70s. So in the 10 years forward, it made what was considered a low return, but a pretty good return. Here's the catch. We started the decade with 6% CPI. We ended with 13% CPI. So if someone says on a compounded basis, what did investors likely lose? 4 to 5% real. Okay, that was the numbers. How do I anecdotally prove that? My dad got in the investment business in 1980. You couldn't sell a stock to someone. By the way, bonds had done terrible the entire time, like stocks. So nobody wanted to buy a bond either, a long-term bond. What did people want to do? They sat in the money market fund collecting 13%. Okay? And so that's what was done at the time. Coca-Cola, my dad would tell you, it was at 6 times earnings, paying a 5% dividend. Nobody wanted to touch it. Okay? So that was after an era of what I'll call stock market failure. If you go back to that slide for a quick second, you'll see that the orange line coincides with the 10-year forward S&P 500 returns. But if you look at the right y-axis, you'll find that they're negatively inverted. In other words, there's a negative return at the high points of it in certain eras. And at the low points of that data, you got double-digit returns the S&P 500. So just to clarify, I'm not saying that all stocks will do poorly. So to your point, Danny, if one of the chamber members are watching this, they're publicly traded, they're like, Cole said we're going to do terrible. That's not what Smead Capital is saying. We're saying the composition of the S&P 500, how it's built, and the companies that comprise it today are likely to do poorly. If you're 0.01% of the S&P, you might not have that problem.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I point that out because in 99, it was negative 1% that you lost from that highest point ever. As of 2021, the end of the year 2021, the 10 years forward, I fully expect to be negative returns because it was the highest ever. And if we did negative 1 in 99, so people always ask us, like, where do you think we're at? It's 6-month leg data. I think we're pretty close to the 21 high. If you had to catch up to what the markets have done and what stock ownership has done, especially with stock-based comp being used as prevalently as it is. And so we're somewhere in the 0 or maybe negative returns. And here's the funny part. When I tell people that, they look back at me like I'm anti-capitalism, like I'm un-American. Because this is like American exceptionalism that I'm mocking in a way.
Yeah.
And here's the weird part. That's illogical to me. And humans often do illogical things because they do human things, not logical things. And I say that because to assume that we espouse certain ideals as Americans that are unique to us, that is patently false. Now, to your point, have we respected things like property rights in a way that is unique to the world? Yes. So I think that has benefited us directly. But the idea that like a stock buyback can't be done by a European, for example, because they're Belgian, that's just bizarre. But I'll use a term that came up in Nikki Hayes' book, one of my favorite terms, gestalt. Right? The idea that the sum is greater than the whole. I think that's what we're seeing. I think that's what causes confidence in these eras of stock market returns. I'll add one other thing, and we don't normally talk about this because, again, I hate to kind of like go. I think that data is so good. You could set your clock to it. It doesn't tell you what stock to own. Okay, it doesn't tell you what businesses are going to do individually, but it tells you broad. It's kind of like you're odds making, right? You're setting the book, if you will. So what am I telling people? Don't be broadly diversified. take unique risks to try to go make your money. That's what I'm trying to say. Now, I'm biased in saying that, but that being said, that's been a pretty good guide for history. Let me throw out some other crazy things I don't hear people say. So one of the more abusive practices, and again, I might frustrate some chamber members with this because if you're the CEO, this is a good chunk of your comp. But stock-based comp is really an American thing. It is an American practice.
And a tech thing.
Correct. Well, tech, but American thing. Because like the tech compensation consultant then turns to the rest of American industry and says, hey, I had ideas with these people. Look what they did. Let me sell you what I sell. And Charlie Munger said, I think 5 years ago, he said prostitution would be a step up for compensation consultants. Okay. Now, so an adjustment we make when we think about this is the idea of free cash flow. So by definition, historically speaking, free cash flow is your cash flow from operations minus any CapEx is a pretty basic definition. The catch is that now that we pay stock-based compensation, where I'm going to give you stock, but I take it out of my net income, how you would make that adjustment is people typically add stock-based compensation back for free cash flow, which means it's like selling secondary stock to your employees in lieu of cash, okay? Now, as an owner, if I give, let's say I'm the sole owner of Smead Capital Management and I give 1% to Seamus and 1% to Danny, I take that out of my net income. Was that really free cash flow to me? The answer is no, because now they collect a future liability on all future income streams. So it's not only not free, but also the reality of the situation is it's a future liability forever.
Well, and they use share buybacks
well, they
to
usually
offset
typically buy it
that,
back.
which
Yeah.
is a actual,
Correct.
right?
So I say that because if you make those adjustments, I just want to read some things on this to kind of give people a sense of where we're at. So we showed that chart. I think returns are going to be poor. Now let's think about some of the numbers, okay? Let's say I go look at Mr. Softy, or as other people call him, Microsoft, and say, okay, what if I make an adjustment like that on their free cash flow to say, let's back out the stock-based compensation and ask what's the actual owner earnings, assuming that stock-based compensation is not free. Well, here's the numbers. If I back that out, if I go look at the trailing, if I back that out of Microsoft is trading for 66 times trailing free cash flow when you back out the stock-based compensation. Now, why don't you hear that from a Wall Street analyst?
Nobody does the work.
They don't consider it a cost. Mm-hmm. And Buffett used to joke around like with stock options, if it's not a cost or it's not an expense, what is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's ridiculous.
And it is a true economic expense. Okay. Yeah. Now, if I use it on a forward, let's say I put what the street thinks they're going to make and I take last year's stock-based comp, it's still trading at 55 times free cash flow. Okay. So it's like, I love our industry. Things change, and then we get back to like this timeless idea of like, well, what do you trade relative to your free cash, and what's the definition of free cash? That's a timeless principle. Okay, let me list out the others because I put these together. If I use Amazon and I back out stock-based compensation for trailing free cash, they only made $8 billion of free cash last year, which would mean it's trading currently on 250 times trailing. And if I go on a forward, which again, the danger in the forward is I don't know what stock comp's going to be here. I'm just using last year as an example. Mm-hmm. I think it'll be higher because stocks have gone up. But if I use last year's stock-based comp, it's 60 times forward free cash flow. Google is 50 times trailing free cash flow, 38 times forward. So back to the idea of cost of money. Let's say, Danny, we wake up in an era where the cost of money is aggressively fighting. Ultimately, government paper causes a lot more competition for capital, and people are unwilling to take more risk because the government paper provides such a good return, even though the government paper is coming from us spending like drunken sailors and running us bigger budget deficits that cause inflation, but yet you're not taking any risk and affects risk-free assets differently than risk assets. Do I think those kind of multiples historically hold with the biggest and brightest American companies? The answer is no, it didn't work for the Nifty 50 either, and those were the best and brightest U.S. companies in 1972 or the conglomerates that built up in the late 1960s. And so I think that's the real danger is not only the competition for money, but it's not happening now because while markets go up, people can say, well, I have big capital gains. Why would I sell? When markets do poorly, those capital gains go away. And therefore, the friction to make a change and go to a risk-free rate that competes becomes different.
And the cost to keep those employees, if your stock is going down, becomes all of a sudden
different,
higher,
right?
Yeah,
and so back to our AI conversation. Think about it like this: if AI proliferates while this goes on, they're going to try to cut costs because that stock-based compensation is a real cost, but they won't do it till later. Hey, I want to give a big shout out to everyone who's been working so hard on the show. You know, we recently hit the top 10 investing podcasts on Apple Podcasts and even number 1 in the business category in several countries. As you may know, this show is brought to you by Smead Capital Management. Smead Capital Management understands how frustrating and illogical the stock market can be. If you are searching for funds with a proven track record, give the Smead funds a look, or better yet, reach out at smeadcap.com. And don't forget to mention that you're a fan of the podcast. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Investing involves risks, including loss of principal. Please refer to the prospectus for important information about the investment company, including objectives, risks, charges, and expenses. Read and consider it carefully before investing. Smead Funds distributed by UMB Distribution Services, LLC, not affiliated. Now, could you get into a world where they make more free cash compared to those multiples I'm talking about, and the stocks still go down? Yeah, because if the multiples go down, they could go 50% higher in free cash, and you still could lose a lot of money as an investor. I think the idea that American exceptionalism should get freakishly big premiums, that's the part that I have tough. Mm-hmm. Because ultimately, in the long run, it's the returns on capital of a business that matter, and we use free cash flow as our definition of returns on a business, and a lot of the Wall Street analysts don't use those definitions today. So like I could go look and say the Fred data looks bizarre. The free cash flow multiples look bizarre. The cost of the risk-free rate looks too easy. And everyone is owning this passive index, thinking it's going to be peachy keen. And like Nikki Hayes talked about with bloodletting in her book, it was easy. It was acceptable. You couldn't get wrong doing it. Well, that's how I feel about passive investing. It reminds me of bloodletting, which is... I mean, we're such learned people, gentlemen.
No, I'm listening to you, and I'm thinking, as someone who manages such a large portfolio, and you work with, ideally a lot of our members' retirement plans, and even the potentially government ones. How do you really compete if someone's out? It's almost like you're up against people promising the world still, and the numbers at the moment back that up, and you're trying to. At what point are you like, these guys are Chicken Little? The sky's always falling with Smead Capital.
Yeah.
They're downers. We want optimistic investors. When I would argue, Cole, based on what you just said, you kind of have a blend of optimism and pessimism.
Well, yeah, but to your point, how can you get a bad economy when the government's spending this much? So I joke, and I don't know if I've said this on the podcast, but I treat a bad economy, it's like a unicorn. Sure, we know it's possible. We just can't seem to find one. Okay. And so look at the jobs market. If you look at Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, 5% wage growth year over year for every income group. Okay. Yeah. Our biggest problem is we don't have enough people in the labor market. Okay. So
that's right. Our unemployment rate just hit 3.4, which is the record now for the state of Arizona. It's never been lower than it has right now.
And this is where people are coming. So we're trying to bring in people as quickly as we can. So I look at it like this, to kind of put to your point, people confuse the economy with the stock market often. In Buffett's Sun Valley Talk in 1999, he talked about his 17-year cycle theory, 64 to 81, 81 to 98, and 98 on. And he said that from 60, I got to make sure I got my numbers right there. Yeah, 64 to 81. He said the economy grew a lot. Obviously, inflation was very strong. Government spending was really strong. Stocks did poorly. That's strange. How did the economy do so well and yet stocks didn't do well? And the answer is because everything else was sucking up the money. The real economy was sucking up the money. Government paper was sucking up the money. Inflationary pressures were sucking up the money. That's the kind of environment we're in. So I think this is a great economy. The largest consumer in this economy is a millennial that was born from 1980 to 2000 who has kids like we all do, and they're out consuming a lot of their income. That's super good for the economy. The danger is translating that directly to function with the stock market. I'll add one more thing, and you guys all know this, but just to make sure, I'm like the long run eternal optimist as we are as a firm, and my dad as well. Like we're just long run optimists. Like the future is always going to be brighter. Humans are going to create great solutions, but the value of assets and companies will change with ebbs and peaks and troughs of enthusiasm in investing. And so here we have the whole meme stock thing going on again. It wasn't good in 21. I don't think it's going to work out now. And it's funny. I mean, I don't know about you, Seamus, but like in our industry, Because how old are you? You're 40.
44.
44. I'm 40. I feel like an old fuddy-duddy half the time where it's like, oh, yeah, it's young kids, you know.
It's definitely, to your point, I mean, we came into this business, we've seen nothing but this, right? I mean, for the most part, like 2007, 2008 is when I came into the business. We've seen nothing but largest money, tech, and markets go nowhere but up, and ETFs buy mindlessly what they tell them to buy. It's not a utility. Markets are not a utility.
Well,
They're not guaranteeing
who said everyone's got to win?
That's right.
No, 100%. But let me ask you this: on the meme stock, do you think that, again, social media has played a huge part of this?
Huge.
Right now everyone's an expert investor. Now everyone gets on and posts their ginormous returns and have.
I think that's so obscene. When I see people posting their personal account returns, it's the height of arrogance.
Now, let me ask you this though: at what point do you say this is going to be here for a while, and do we have to kind of counter it with real information, for the markets, or do people in your profession start entering the social media game? You've got great studios, you've got great podcasts. How do you push back on that information?
Well, I mean, the book that I think a lot about is, you know this, Danny. The politicians will always close the barn doors after the animals are already out. That's the history. So we did Taming the Street, wonderful book on the creation of the SEC. I'll talk my book. William O. Douglas, who is of Whitman College fame, ended up becoming, longtime Supreme Court justice, was at the SEC prior, and he's really a patron saint in the SEC. So that came out of the Pecora hearings that happened after the 29 crash and the self-dealing, and then Joe Kennedy was the first SEC chair. And so I point that out because what will happen is once people have lost money stupidly, then we'll come in and say, gosh, you know what? We shouldn't allow this. This isn't good for society. You'll hear the ghost of Charlie Munger saying, no, we're ruining society by doing this. To go one step further, am I surprised that the meme stop thing is going on while gambling in sports is proliferated? And we have athletes ruining their lives and their careers over gambling. So we're worse off. We're going to have to ask societal questions after things have gone really bad. And therefore, we're going to overregulate at some point, okay? I think the only thing I really hope out of this, and this is a real estate town by history, okay? Think of the illiquidity of real estate in a lot of places right now. This is something like our friend Andrew Chaney and I've talked about, and other people in real estate here in town I've talked about with, is I think the one interesting part is there might be times where even at lower valuations, the equity markets could be the liberators of problems of the economy. So for example, I could see an era where we're taking private real estate assets that are having trouble getting a bid, putting them together with other assets, and then doing share for real estate swaps. Because at least the great part about the market is they provide a public price of whatever they want, and therefore it's what the market bears. And so I think, it doesn't mean all is going to be terrible, but we have some real problems we've got to address in how these markets behave. Do I think that enough has been done to understand what these people are doing? I mean, no. I think it's crazy that like an investment advisor has to go out and in a regulated way provide surety around what they're saying, and like the Tom, Dick, or Harry doesn't have to do anything.
Roaring Kitty or whatever the hell his name is.
Yeah. And by the way, kudos to him. He made a lot of money. I tip my cap. I love getting trolled by the meme stock people after I say like this is degenerate gambling. I have like 3 or 4 people like pop it up and you're like, oh, am my house gonna get egged? Or, something like that. So let's see. First off, this has been tons of fun. Seamus, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
And thank you for bringing the Diamondback swag. I'm a big Diamondbacks fan, so as Seamus knows, we have some pretty good seats that we get to enjoy from time to time. Danny, we're going to have to do this again. I don't know how often. With your travel schedule, we might have to do like a call in with Danny and like your number one book pitch, in 6 months or something like that.
I love it. I love getting book ideas from you. And last thing I would say, anyone thinking about moving to Dallas, they should check out the news stories from this week about Texas losing out on a treaty with Mexico for water. So that's a real water problem. That's my last plug against Texas.
Talking his book. Jeez. Everyone does it here. Well, Danny, Seamus, thank you for joining me to share with podcast listeners what is on the Smead book list. For our listeners, if you have a great book that you'd like to recommend, email podcast@smeadcap.com. That's podcast@smeadcap.com. You can also reach out to us on X. Our handle is @SmeadCap. Danny, what's your handle?
Oh, at DB Seiden, DB-SEIDEN. So yeah.
Yeah, you can look up Danny on X as well. We'll give you a shout out next quarter when we do this again. If you got book recommendations, like to send us there. Thank you for joining us for the Smead book list on a Book with Legs podcast. We look forward to the next episode.
Thank you for listening to A Book with Legs, a podcast brought to you by Smead Capital Management. The material provided in this podcast is for informational use only and should not be construed as investment advice. You can learn more about Smead Capital Management and its products at smeadcap.com or by calling your financial advisor.